Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing okay. It's another gloomy day, but a bit of baking always cheers one up. Today I'm going to be showing you how to make a Polish apple pie, which is one of my absolute favourites. It's different from a traditional apple pie in that it has no top crust. Instead, the crust is leftover pastry dough that is grated onto the top and usually finished with a nice little bit of cinnamon and maybe some demerara sugar. Also, instead of using a pie dish, it's quite normal to use a cake tin. This is an 8-inch cake tin approximately, and it has a loose base. This is my favourite tin. It's kind of, as you can see, been in the wars. It's a long story, but basically our oven failed and Dan decided to barbecue the cake, which came out okay, although shall we say it had a crispy crust on the outside, but nonetheless the inside was delicious. Unfortunately, the cake tin got slightly charred, but there's still absolutely nothing wrong with it. We gave it a good soak and pretty soon it was back to normal with no aftertaste whatsoever. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to grease the base and the sides of this cake tin, and I'm using a butter paper to do that. So let's get down to it. And there we go. Next, I have sieved 200 grams of plain flour into a bowl, and I've added just a pinch of salt. Now we will add about 100 grams of cold cubed butter. Here's the butter, all cubed. And we're using the rubbing in method. Break the butter up with your fingertips. Try to use the fingertips more than the fingers themselves. You can also do it in a food processor if you prefer. It will be quicker. You can also use the back of the fork to break up the bits of butter. You want it to resemble fine breadcrumbs. Do it from a height to get some air into it. It will give a much lighter pastry, and if it's kept nice and cold it will be lovely and melt in the mouth. Nice and short with a little bit of crumble on the bite. Gorgeous. I've been baking for most of my life. I started baking when I was 6 years old, and I haven't stopped since. And if anybody's wondering, that's 55 years worth of baking and cooking. In fact, I was living in Africa as a small girl and learned how to cook on an open fire, and I can cook anything on a fire or a barbecue. One of my talents that I'm especially proud of being able to do. So in a worst case scenario, I would still be able to provide food for myself and Dan and anybody else who needed it. Add a little water at a time. This pie I'm making ahead for Christmas. I fancied making something different from Last year we had meringue. We did have Christmas pudding, but not until after Christmas. I like to mix things up a bit sometimes. I don't always like to do traditional. I just make what I feel like making when I make it, really. And Dan and my mill, they don't really mind what dessert I make because they all say it's delicious. As we had several Bramleys in the fridge that needed using, I thought, I'll make a Polish apple pie. What's also different about the apple pie is that the apple isn't in pieces, it's actually cooked first until it all falls. I cooked it and added a little bit of honey at the end just to give it a slightly sweet note. Just a tablespoon of honey for the 3 large Bramley apples. If you go into a Polish shop, you can get apple made that way in large jars. That's the apple you need for this Polish apple pie recipe. This is coming together really well now. I'm going to put it on a board, bring it into a ball, and then refrigerate for about 20 minutes, half an hour. Reasonably thin. I don't like very thick pastry. I like a crispness to it. And you want everything to cook through really well. I'm going to try and do as near to a square as possible. Then we're going to put it in the base of the tin and damp the edges with a bit of water. And then we're going to do the side strips and press them down as firmly as possible into the base so there's no cracks. We don't want to lose any of that apple, and it's going to be coming out of its tin later and frozen. So it needs to stay together. Check. Not quite. I'm going to add a bit more and re-roll. Don't worry if it doesn't turn out right on the first roll. Try not to touch it too much though, because the pastry soon heats up, and then you won't get as good a finish as you would have done if you'd barely touched it at all. Remember, your hands are warm usually. Even if you've got quite cold hands, they do bring some heat to the table, shall we say. We'll try and eyeball this a little bit better than the first attempt. Nearly there. Yep, we're about there. And lift it up over the rolling pin and then try and place it in the bottom of the tin as straight as possible. It doesn't matter if there's a bit of overlap. Just remember to make sure when you've done your other pieces that everything is tight. trim that bit off there. And that's the base. Now let's start on the sides. It doesn't have to go right up to the top if you haven't got enough pastry. That should be about right, that looks about right. I'm going to cut that in there. And cut that in there. I'm just going to brush the edges of the base with a little bit of water. And I'm actually going to do the same with the bottom edge of the first piece of pastry. Press well into the corners, pinch and press. And trim. Press everything well into the corner. And that's the first piece done. Before you put the next piece on, make sure you moisten that corner there, because everything has to meet. It can be a bit tricky to navigate. Get everything into the corners. Give it a press down and then trim the edge. And there we go. We just now keep going and do the other two sides. If there's any gaps at all, just fill it with a little bit of moistened pastry in the corner. There aren't actually any gaps in this, but I'm just demonstrating that to you. Just press it there in the corner. Make sure there's no gaps, that everything is watertight. And now we can put that on a baking tray. I'm going to bake this blind. First thing I'm going to do is put a few fork marks in the base. This stops it from rising up. You want it as flat as possible. Here we go. I have a little bit of leftover pastry. This is going to be grated on the top of the pie. So I'm going to cut off a little bit of paper, wrap that up and pop it in the freezer. This is going in the freezer now for about 15-20 minutes. I've scrunched up a piece of greaseproof paper after dampening it with a bit of water. That's going in the base, and I'm going to add some baking beans as well to weight it down. If you don't have any baking beans, which are usually ceramic or glass, you can use dried rice, beans, chickpeas, and then when they've served the purpose, you can just keep them then aside in a safe place to reuse. These are ceramic beans. I'm going to slip quite a few in That should be enough. Just to weight it down. There's enough there for a large pie or quiche. That's now going in the oven to a bake blind for about 15 minutes at 180 Celsius, 350 Fahrenheit, gas mark 4. The pastry's had 10 to 15 minutes. I'm going to brush the base of it now with a little bit of egg. This helps to stop any cracks, although it doesn't have any. One of the sides has slipped down slightly, but it seems to be okay. It doesn't matter either, it's holding. This will go back in the oven now for about 5 minutes, and then we can go on to the next stage. I'll brush up the sides a bit as well. It's looking good. So while the pie is finishing baking rind, I have here the nice stewed apple. As I said before, you can buy it like this in jars from the Polski Sklep. This though I prepared myself. I'm going to add a little bit of cinnamon. I've tasted the apple. It doesn't need any more sweetening. I just added a tablespoon of honey once it's all mushed down. I've added about a teaspoon of cinnamon. The pie's out of the oven now. I'm going to add most of the apple, or maybe all of it. Should all go in. Yum. That goes in nicely. Make sure it's in all the corners. I'm grating the frozen pastry over the top. This is ostensibly the top pie crust. Make sure it's spread evenly over the whole pie. Be careful moving it about. Make sure it's all covered though. You need to do it as quickly as possible because it does tend to melt fairly quickly. Again, because of the friction of the grater and your hands as well. But that's how it looks. I'm going to add a little bit of cinnamon to the top. Just sprinkle it on. I'm going to add a little bit of demerara sugar as well. Just sprinkle that over the top. There we go. And I'm going to put this back in the oven now. It'll probably take about 30 to 35 minutes at the same temperature. If the sides tend to brown quicker than the top, just turn it down a tad, maybe to 160, and cover the top with foil so it has a chance to cook all the way through. It's a very deep pie, so it needs quite a bit of cooking to get it done there. And there we go. This is the beautiful, gorgeous Polish apple pie out of the oven and cooling. You can see there the cinnamon. It smells delicious. I'm going to let that cool completely and then we will get it out of the tin and wrap it up ready for freezing.